There has been many attempts, millions of hours and billions of dollars spent to wipe out the Palestinian identity. But I can assure you that our youth hasn't forgotten, and every day the support for the Palestinian cause is growing. When our people were kicked out of their homes, we were enjoying peace. They were enjoying their land, they were enjoying their home, but the thing is that they were replaced by other people coming from the other side of the world and claiming that this is their land because God promised, as if God is a state agent. Ladies and gentlemen, I wouldn't say much history because I know the panel here are probably more capable, and they are for this purpose. But because of that, because we want to shine a light on our cause, to bring to light the struggle of our people, the injustice that's been implemented on our people, the atrocity that they have been subjected to, the collective punishment, the hope for the Palestinian people for freedom, we decided to set up Palestine Community Foundation to introduce our history, our story, our culture. We are so proud that our history is written on our dresses, on our embroidery, on our food, on our maramiyya, on our za'atar, on everything in our life. There is a detailed that you can see Palestine in it. So the Palestinian people are deeply rooted in the history of that area. And as Nelson Mandela said, our freedom is not complete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. So hopefully one day we will together celebrate the freedom and justice for the Palestinian people. Thank you.
We are all the past, the present, and the future, all of us, all rolled in together. And in the Palestinian case, the past is the present. That's the problem, is that I wish we could say that in 1948, such and such happened, and then various things, and now we are back in our country, and that was a bad memory, and it really does belong to the past. We cannot say that, and you know it as well as I do. We are living this Nakba of 1948 today. It never ended, really. It's very difficult to encapsulate this great tragedy in a few words, as I'm having to do tonight. But I'm sure that everybody here, whatever they feel about Israel or Palestine, can understand and empathize with the experience of people who are not politicians. They're not engaged in a war. They're not combatants. They're ordinary people, as we were, to have these terrible things happen to them. I'm part of a dwindling number of Palestinians, because of the passage of time, obviously, who are in a position to talk about this very seminal event, which is the reason we are here tonight, isn't it? I mean, we're here because of what happened in 1948. You have to imagine that leaving meant leaving everything that, well, if you look at me as a child, everything I knew, everything. My whatever little life I had, it had in it other children I played with, it had in it the dog, the family dog, it had in it Fatima, the woman who used to look after us, help my mother in the house. All these things vanished just like that. All I can remember is fear. Fear, fear. I didn't know what of, but I was frightened as well. I didn't know. My parents were frightened. Anyway, we got to Damascus. That's a long story. We stayed there for a while, waiting to go home. And you know, this is the story of the Palestinians, waiting to go home. Now, that was very vivid in the early period of the Nakba, where people couldn't believe, nobody could believe it possible that a people who fled were driven out or fled in fear because of soldiers, because of shooting, the kind of natural reaction normal people have to conditions of war. They don't sit there grimly with their children being shot at. They evacuate, they are evacuated with the idea that when things, quote, settle down, they come back again. And you must try and visualize what it felt like in Damascus, waiting for the word which said, the United Nations has worked this out, you can all come home now. Never happened. I believe, and I have written about, and I stand by, the view that this dreadful mess that is now present in Israel-Palestine cannot be resolved except in one way, and that's hard enough. And by that I mean that the people who inhabit that country now have to live together, but on a basis of equality.
It's quite easy or less challenging to talk about how apartheid and the occupation, how it affects Palestinians economically and their legal status. It's also less challenging to describe how it affects their life quality. For example, the water supply, the electricity supply and all. But it's much more difficult to try to imagine how it affects Palestinian people, especially vulnerable groups, such as children, how it affects them psychologically and how it affects them emotionally. We might think that we know the full effects of apartheid, but we don't. And as a demonstration, I'd like you to look at this picture in the background. We still don't know how apartheid works and what is its effects. How could apartheid possibly affect this elderly Russian couple living 1,300 miles away from Palestine? And how could it affect that little girl in the picture? Can you recognize her? Yeah. How could it affect that little girl? So, to start with, I was born and raised in Hebron. As you might notice from the map, it's partitioned. For those who don't know, Hebron is a classic case of apartheid. Different streets for Arabs, different for Palestinians, different street for Israeli settlers. Lots of checkpoints everywhere. Can you see that little spot on the left-hand side? Can you see it? That's where my parents' house is. So growing up, apartheid and the settlement was a huge part of my life. Either simply by passing through the settlement to get to the other part of the city, going to the library, to the city center, just everyday life things. And it's just literally a couple of 100 meters away. And a lot of my childhood friends lived within the contours of the settlement because a lot of Palestinian families still holding on to their property and their houses in H2, which H2 is for Israeli settlers and H1 is for the Arab population. Now, growing up under apartheid did not make any sense to me as a child. A lot of people might criticize me for this, but it bred in me a sense of inferiority. I always felt inferior. The nicely paved sidewalks, the polished streets, the beautiful houses, the benches on the side, and the insanely green lawns. I compare them in my head to the ugly gray cubes surrounded by arid yellow land that I called my neighborhood. My mom did not make things any better, did not make things any easier. When I asked my mom, when I complained, why can we not have water balloon fights? Why can we not have bubble baths? My mom would always tell me this, which Edward Said would not be happy with. She would say to me, Yana, this is a desert. It did not make any sense to me, thinking of the settlement. I remember even being quite angry at God, thinking, why does God send all the rainy clouds to the other side and not my neighborhood? One evening, summer's evening, has anyone been to the Middle East in the summer? It's quite nice in the evening. So we went back home with my sister. I was 8, she was 6. We went back home and my mom met us at the door and she said to us in Russian, does anyone understand Russian? She said to us, "Давайте, девочки, мы будем купаться," which basically means, come on little girls, we're having a bath. Now, bath is quite a broad word for it because it would usually be like a quick shower because we could not afford water and water supply was very irregular. So I followed my mom to the bathroom and I saw her plugging the tub, but I never saw that happening before. And I got all excited and I was like, what's happening? She was like, we're having a real bath. And I ran to my sister, and I said to her, you're going to see my sister in the end. And I said to her, get the toys right now. It's happening. We're having a bubble bath. And I ran back to my mom, and all of a sudden, the water taps were closed. Water was off, and we had this much of water in the tub. And I had a look, and I was like, what is this? And she, of course, she used her technique, and she said to me, well, Yana, we don't have enough bubble bath product. But it was quite difficult to argue with me, so I looked at it and said, we can always use shampoo. So she kind of realized she had to change the technique, so she said to me, well, Yana, we've got to share water. And there I jumped, and I said, no, we don't. My dad told me. Some background information. Palestinians build water wells because of the irregular water supply. It's their coping technique with the reality and with the conditions. So most Palestinian families share water wells, but luckily enough, we did not have to, and my dad told me so. So this is how I responded to my mom. No, we don't have to share water with my uncles. My dad told me so. So she got quite frustrated, and she said, not with your uncles, with the Israelis. And that was the first time I hear the word Israeli in my whole life. I was 8. And I was like, who? And she said to me, pointing in the direction of the settlement, the people living on the hilltop. I was like, okay, fine. So I went back to my sister, put away the toys. It's not happening. Why? It's because mom says we have to share water. No, we don't. My dad told me. Well, I had to go about it. I was like, no, we have to share with the Israeli Tani. She was 6. She was like, who? I was like, oh, you don't know? Wait, let me tell you. It's the Israeli-Tanians, the people living on the hilltop. So she kind of, I don't think she heard what I said because she was off already putting away the toys. Here's the ironic thing. Most of Palestinian homes have bathtubs that they never use. We never use them. And still, young couples still build bathtubs and install them in their houses in the hope that one day we'll have enough water to bathe once or twice, to have a proper bath once or twice a year. I think the new symbol for Palestinian struggle should be a bathtub. In that same summer, we traveled to Russia. After a long and arduous trip, Babushka and Yedushka, my grandmother and grandfather, they received us, hugs and kisses, and we had dinner. Then after dinner, I followed my grandmother. I was quite excited. And I saw her going to the bathroom. And I saw her again plugging the tub. Didn't want to get too excited, you know, might not end up well. So I was like, sneakily, I stood by the door, and I leaned against the wall, and I was like, Babushka, what are you doing? Are you cleaning? Well, she looked at me and said, no, Yana, we're having a bubble bath. I looked at her and I said, but you don't have any bubble bath product. She's like, it's fine, we can use shampoo. I ran to my sister. I was like, get the toys, it's happening. I promise this time. And as about like she was off to get the toys, she turned at me and she said, are there no Israeli Tani here? She couldn't understand. We didn't understand. It's quite heartbreaking. If you look at this picture, can you recognize me? I'm the little one on the right. And that's my sister, the blondie. So that was the last time I saw my grandparents. Today, I would like to take the opportunity to call on to encouraging and integrating such domains of knowledge, which I really care about psychology and how it affects children. I'd like to call on to encouraging and integrating such domains of knowledge into future studies and take them into consideration when formulating and promoting political action to dismantle apartheid, the all-traumatizing experience for all people living under apartheid in Palestine and everywhere in the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yana.
As long as the Palestinians are out of Palestine, as long as we are homeless, we are displaced, we are refugees, I don't think we will ever forget Palestine. We'll always dream that the day of return is as near, as close as ever. The right of return the right of repatriation is the core of the Palestinian question and struggle. Actually, it is the spinal cord. Its importance is not less than the spinal cord to the body. The right of return is inalienable, legal, logical, legitimate, possible, probable, individual, collective. No one is authorized to cede or to relinquish or to waiver it. The right of return stands for the ever inherent relationship that reflects the inseparable and breakable bond between the Palestinian people and Palestine. The Great March of Return is the brainchild of the Palestinian people from all the walks of life, refugees, civil society, organizations, churches, mosques, writers, authors, tribal chiefs, women's organizations, lawyers, doctors, universities, academics. And it is peaceful and non-violent. Multitudes of Palestinians, every Friday and every day, they make their pilgrimage to the Israeli-imposed borders. It was called Palestine, it remains Palestine, and it will be Palestine, where Muslims, Christians, Jews, believers, non-believers can live in honor and dignity, in peace, justice, equality. This is the hoped for and the long-cherished Palestine that should replace the Zionist settler colonial state called apartheid Israel. It's high time that justice be done, wrongs redressed, rights honored. Probably you are all aware of the part that your country played in the catastrophe, in the Nakba, in the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, from the infamous Balfour Declaration to May's statement in which she says the Balfour Declaration is the most important letter in history. Instead of apologizing for the Palestinian people for the crimes and for ethnic cleansing, she still wants to celebrate and to support that state. The last thing I will say is taken from a book by Ronette Linton, an Israeli Jew as well, to sum up what has happened. Ronette says, this is, and she's an Israeli, we stole the land of another people, and that's not who we are. We are better than this. We expelled 800,000 of the owners of the land, this is in 1948, or made them flee. We renamed their villages, urban neighborhoods, and settled our people in them. But this is not who we are. We are better than this. We massacred the population of those villages, tortured their men, raped their women, and beat and tortured their children. But this is not who we are. We are better than this. We occupied and annexed those parts of the land that we had conquered in our war of independence, so-called war of independence, that the owners of the land called the Nakba or catastrophe. But this is not who we are. We are better than this. We bombed their cities, demolished their homes, flattened their refugee camps, and since 2002, built 700 kilometers long concrete wall, which we call the separation barrier, and the owners of the land called the apartheid wall, to cut off the owners of the land from each other. But that's not who we are. We are better than this. We build our settlements on the land and allow our illegal settlers to prevent the owners of the land from herding their flocks, tilling their fields, and picking their olives. But this is not who we are. We are better than this. We started war after war outside 1948 armistice borders of our state, making hundreds of thousands homeless, claiming self-defense, but this is not who we are. We are better than this. And finally, we deny the owners of the land the right to remember and commemorate their Nakba and force them to study our writers and our poets. But that's not who we are. We are better than this. You see, we are victims of persecution and Holocaust survivors. And the land had been promised to us by our Lord, by God. And thus, legally ours, and anyone questioning our right to conquer, to settle, expropriate, kill, imprison, shoot, bomb, torture, transfer, and deport is an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. End of quote. The last thing I can say, the Palestinian people cannot be overcome. Struggle and we will win. We want to live with the Jews, with the Christians, with the Muslims, with the believers, with the non-believers in a democratic, non-sectarian, secular state in peace, justice, democracy, equality for everybody. And this is why we call upon everybody to help us execute this project, which will end the problem once and for all, and will prove that the Arabs and the Jews are cousins in the full sense of the word. Thank you.
I was one of the legal advisors to the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, which met on 6 occasions. And on one of these occasions, it met in Cape Town in November of 2011. And there was a panel of respected witnesses and jurists who heard evidence and reached conclusions. And I'm summarizing largely what's in a report which was issued by that tribunal. My task in the 13 minutes I have is to try and explain to you the definition, the legal definition of apartheid, and then how it applies to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. The first thing to emphasize is that you need to put out of your minds the experience of black people in South Africa as being the measure of what apartheid is. Of course, it was apartheid. It existed. We all understand that it has led to a legal definition of apartheid. But the legal definition of apartheid doesn't require a replica of the situation in South Africa to exist for that legal wrong, and sometimes a crime, to come into being. And I want to explain the constituent parts of the legal definition of apartheid. So the constituent parts are the three core elements. That there are 2 distinct racial groups that can be identified, sometimes more, but at least 2. That inhuman acts are committed against the subordinate group, and that such acts are committed systematically in the context of an institutionalized regime of domination by one group over the other. So those are the 3 core elements. And they arose as a series of legal definitions and detailed definitions through a series of international treaties, which I'm going to go into in some depth, but in order to get to the point of trying to apply those legal definitions to the situation in Israel. So one other thing to mention is, so that's the definition of apartheid, but the crime of apartheid, so there's a complication, because not all instances, like instances of a wrong committed to you and me in the street, they may be a wrong, what we sometimes lawyers call a civil wrong, but they may not be a criminal act. But where we have individual inhuman acts, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime, then you have crimes of apartheid. When we get to the 3 core elements, the requirement of 2 distinct racial groups and the commission of inhuman acts of apartheid requires us to look carefully at the definition of race. So the definition of apartheid requires domination by a racial group, as I say. If a group identifies itself as such and is identified as such by others, for example, through discriminatory practices, then it comes under the protection of the convention. The concept of race has long been shown as a social construct, not a biological category. So international human rights law has allowed a wider scope for the meaning of race than traditional black versus white parameters. And the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has included groups that wouldn't be considered races in that kind of traditional sense. Caste groups in South Asia, non-citizens groups such as migrant workers and nomadic peoples. Leading experts on this whole issue gave evidence, and it became clear that clearly the Palestinian people constitute a race within the required definition for apartheid to exist, where they are subjected to discrimination, institutionalized discrimination. So what are the constitutive acts of apartheid? They're set out in Article 2 of the Apartheid Convention, and the following inhuman acts are established in Article 2 as the constitutive acts of apartheid. So it says, for the present purposes, the crime of apartheid shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa, and shall apply to the following inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over another racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Denial to a member or members of a racial group of the right to life and liberty of the person. Murder, obviously, infliction of serious bodily or mental harm, infringement of their dignity, subjecting them to torture or cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment by arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment of the members of the racial group or groups. Deliberate imposition on a racial group of living conditions calculated to cause its or their physical destruction in whole or in part. So there you don't have the legal definition of genocide applying, where there's an actual positive intention of destroying a racial group. If it has the impact of destroying part of a racial group, then you have apartheid or apartheid measures. Under Israeli law and policy, group membership is an official category imposed and monitored by the state, not simply a voluntary identity. Israeli Jews is a group unified by law, sharing the same legal status wherever they reside, so including in occupied territories, while Palestinian Arabs are a separate group, subdivided into citizens, occupied residents, whose residence rights may be lost if they leave the territory in which they live, and refugees who do not have the right to return to any part of historic Palestine. No such restrictions apply to Jews. In fact, those who are not citizens already can acquire Israeli citizenship automatically by relocating to Israel or occupied Palestinian territory. The law that enables this, Israel's 1950 law of return, codifies the descent-based aspect of Jewish identity. Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship are not defined in the same legal category as Jewish citizens who enjoy the further privileges of Jewish nationality. The Jewish nation considers itself a distinct group with a unique claim as the historical indigenous people of Palestine. This has been highlighted and embedded in the law most recently with the passage last July of the nation state of the Jewish people. So when we met in Cape Town, that law hadn't been brought into force. There were early rumblings of it back in 2011. I see in our list that there was some early mention of a bill to protect the values of the State of Israel, the Jewish Democratic State Bill. If only that bill had been passed. That had the notion of a democracy with some equal rights for its citizens. We had a deeply embedded apartheid system up to July 2018, but you had to look in various places to find it. This latest act by the Knesset just brought the whole thing to some kind of huge, obvious peak. Anyone who, I don't have time now to give you all the evidence. If you ask me questions, I can produce some evidence for the other constituent elements and for some of the inhuman acts. But we have, in the passing of this recent legislation, the kind of apotheosis, if you like, of a definition of legal apartheid passed by this Knesset. But it's nothing new, it's just the peak. And we saw the peak coming years and years and years. This report in 2011 in Cape Town wasn't the first such report about how this was developing. And I just want to echo what Rada says. If we move towards equal rights, we obviously demolish the whole pillars of all this apartheid system. If anyone in this room thinks that there's any other way, progressive way of resolving it other than Israel dismantling its apartheid regime, then I don't know where they're living, because that's the starting point. Where we end may be a different matter, but the starting point for me, and I think for those on the panel, is the demolition of this unequal and deeply discriminatory structural racism that exists in Israel.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel.
My question is about the legal aspect of things. If, as you clearly demonstrated, there is the internationally recognised crime of apartheid taking place, specifically since the 2018 legislation, what is anybody doing about it? or what can be done about it, is there anything I can do as an individual?
The very first thing we as citizens can do is lobby our governments to do what they should be doing, which is there's a positive duty on all states to end apartheid wherever it exists. It's clearly in all the international conventions. Making that known to our governments, campaigning about it, doing BDS, in my view. There are a whole series of things that citizens can do to bring to light the facts and to lobby governments to do the right thing. There's a longer list of things that can be done, a longer list of findings by the tribunal, which are on the website of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. I'd urge you to go there because there are a whole list of campaigning ideas that were in the Russell Tribunal.